No one in the city of San Bernardino could have seen what was coming for the closely knit neighborhood of Duffy Street on the morning of May 12, 1989. It all began with a runaway freight train that derailed into the neatly arranged row of homes on the western end of Duffy Street, and then crescendoed with an inferno that incinerated nearly everything else that the train wreck had spared. As volunteers and experts combed through the ruins seeking answers, their discoveries and revelations would paint an even darker hue on the already troubling disasters at San Bernardino. This is the story of how seemingly random and inconsequential choices can snowball into cataclysmic events that change the trajectory of an entire community forever. This is the story of the incident on Duffy Street, San Bernardino. San Bernardino couldn't have been incorporated at a more auspicious time in history. The 1860s brought with it the gold rush, and being nestled between some of the loveliest mountains, San Bernardino was greatly nourished by the economic boom that oil brought to its city. As decades rolled into decades, San Bernardino would come to be known as a railroad center and a picturesque place to raise a family, far enough from Los Angeles to be serene and yet close enough to still be in close proximity to all the best entertainment spots. Sadly, as the 1980s rolled in, things would take a dramatic turn for San Bernardino, once hailed as the all-American city. Economists described the deterioration in the city between 1985 and 1988 as unbelievable, but they sure weren't prepared for the catastrophe that would rock the quiet county just a year later. Spring was just beginning to wind to its close in 1989 at the beginning of May, and Lake Minerals, a mining company, needed to ship off some trona to Colombia. To do this, Lake Minerals first had to move the trona, a whitish substance used to make baking soda, to the port of Los Angeles using a freight train. At the port, the mineral would then be loaded into a ship, from where it will begin its journey to South America. Moving goods via a freight train involves a number of procedures, as you might assume. First, you have to decide on the number of hopper cars you're going to need, which is usually determined by the amount of goods you want to move and the capacity of each car. Lake Minerals had a lot of trona to move, so it decided on 69 hopper cars, each weighing an estimated 100 tons each. The next step after getting your hopper cars is to load them and complete some paperwork. Filling the paperwork accurately is very important because the data provided would form the foundation upon which the train's driver and all of the personnel on board make their decisions about the trip, specifically speed. One false data could prove disastrous. But Lake Minerals was not new to the business. They had done this one too many times. By the 11th of May, everything was set. The hopper cars were loaded, the paperwork was done, processed, and filed. All that was left was for the hopper cars to be hitched to a series of locomotives, and the journey to the West Colton terminal could begin. The route to West Colton was a treacherous one. Drivers would first have to haul their monstrous trains up the San Gabriel Mountains, go through the Cajun Pass, and then slowly descend the mountains and continue to the West Colton terminal. The success of these trips highly depended on the driver's ability to slow down where necessary. And on a good day, that's not a difficult thing to do for an experienced driver like Frank Holland, who had been tasked with the duty of moving Lake Minerals trona on this fateful day. When Holland gets handed his paperwork, he realizes that he's been asked to haul about 3,900 tons of trona, which is about the same size as 10 jumbo jets put together. By his estimation, the 3 locomotives on ground at the Mojave train yard, where Southern Pacific assembles trains and picks up staff, won't deliver enough power if he's going to be driving up and down the mountain to West Colton. So he asks for some assistance. 2 helper locomotives are dispatched, which makes Holland more confident that his train now has more than sufficient power to run up the San Gabriel Mountains and back down to West Colton. All the assemblage and train prep takes several hours, but finally at about 2:30 a.m. of May 12, 1989, Holland and his team begin their journey up north. By this time on the other side of town in San Bernardino City, most residents are sound asleep, getting their bodies rested for their final day of the work week. As the first rays of sun pierce through the black skies, residents slowly begin to wake to another average day. Kids sleepily prepare for school as parents hurry them along, and employees dash around their apartments trying not to be late for work. What they all do not know, however, is that a few miles away, one train driver by the name of Frank Holland is right then foreseeing a doom of epic proportions descending upon them. Holland notices the first sign of trouble with his train at 7:15 a.m. as they began to make their descent down the Cajun Pass. Already, Holland has slowed down the train by engaging the air brakes as soon as they started to descend. But to Holland's and his conductor's shock, the train had started to self-accelerate, gradually surpassing the recommended speed of 25 miles per hour. Alarmed, Holland tried to control the train using both the air brakes and dynamic brakes. He also reached out to the engineers at the helper locomotives to do the same. Now, applying a train's brakes is a delicate dance that requires a lot of skill and meticulousness. So both engineers knew they needed to be extremely careful and yet quick thinking if they wanted to save the train and everybody in it. One wrong move could either overheat the brakes and cause them to malfunction or render them ineffective to stop the train altogether. Holland and his team tried everything, but tragically, the train wouldn't be slowed. By now, the train is fast approaching San Bernadino City, which, unfortunately, has several rows of houses close to the train tracks. Desperate to stop the train before it causes calamity, the engineer on the helper locomotive pulls the emergency brake. Alas, this move turns out to be the calamity itself, as the engagement of the emergency brake disables all dynamic brakes, leaving the pneumatic brakes alone to work. Overheated and overworked, the pneumatic brakes start to melt, officially turning freight train 7551 East into a runaway train. All that's left now is for all individuals on board to brace up and get ready to meet the Grim Reaper. Certain death is now inevitable. Like a horror movie, freight train 7551 East, now running at 110 miles per hour, significantly higher than the recommended speed of just 25 miles per hour, soon derailed. The front locomotives fell over, effectively bulldozing 7 of the 8 residential houses on the western side of Duffy Street, San Bernardino. The helper locomotives soon followed suit, and by the time the dust, or more correctly, the trona, settled, all observers could see were mangled bits of trains and houses caked on top by a thick layer of trona that almost looked like snow on some photos. Responders and volunteers were on site within minutes. Luckily, Holland was able to survive, although with a few broken body parts. The engineer and brakeman in the helper locomotives survived as well. Holland's conductor, head brakeman, and 2 other small children, however, weren't so lucky. They died instantly. As the heavy equipment started to roll into the side of the carnage to help clear the wreckage, the residents of Duffy Street would be led to believe that the worst was over, but they couldn't have been more wrong. However catastrophic they had imagined the train derailment to be, what was coming next would outdo that disaster on every conceivable level. After the incident, the neighbors on Duffy Street would reveal that they had no clue that their houses were sitting right on top of a gas pipeline owned by the oil company Calnev. On the day of the crash, and just before the heavy machinery was brought in, staff of Calnev had rushed to Duffy Street to check on their pipeline. Calnev knew that a crash like that would put undue pressure on the gas in the pipeline, and when such things happen, all it takes is a random spark to create a hellish conflagration. Thankfully, when the Calnev staff inspected their pipeline, all seemed well. The pipeline was buried deep in the ground, and so none of the wreckage was able to pierce through. But just to be safe, the company shut off the gas pipeline. It also planted stakes into the ground so that the people operating the heavy machinery from the cleanup would know to avoid the area. All necessary safety measures seemed to have been taken, and the same was communicated to the residents of Duffy Street. Life could now go back to normal, or as normal as it could possibly get considering the circumstances. But about a week after the traumatizing train wreck, the neighbors at Duffy Street smelled trouble again. A few people woke up that morning to the smell of gas in the air, but since no one knew about the existence of a pipeline under their homes, many didn't know what to make of it. Meanwhile, back at Calnev, pressure from the businesses and residents of nearby Los Angeles had forced the company's hand to reopen the pipeline earlier than planned. By May 25, 1989, it had now been about 2 weeks since the train wreck. That morning at about 8 a.m., residents who were probably still sleeping in fits woke up to what looked like rain drenching their homes. What they would come to realize shortly, though, is that the so-called rain was actually jets of gasoline shooting into the air from a burst underground pipeline, turning their streets into the inside of a combustion engine. In the end, a spark from a random water heater was all it took. The whole of Duffy Street was an inferno in mere seconds. Witnesses who observed the fire from City Hall said that it looked like a nuclear bomb going off. By the time the fire crew arrived, there was little they could do other than watch the fire rage until it ran out of things to consume. Calnev picked up on the pipeline rupture from its end, but could do nothing to stop the flow of gasoline. One of its downstream safety valves had failed to close, and so fuel continued to flow, feeding the insatiable inferno. The fire burned until it ran out of things to burn. Total time of carnage, nearly 7 hours. Total number of things destroyed, 11 houses, 21 cars, and 2 humans. Responders say the only recognizable part of the humans killed in the fire were their shoes. The fire had burned a reported 2 million liters of fuel. the end of the day, the cause of the twin disasters at San Bernardino was multifaceted, a chain of unfortunate choices and circumstances that doomed nearly everyone involved. It started with the paperwork. Lake Minerals personnel had failed to fill in the weight of the cargo he had loaded onto the hopper cars, assuming that the train yard's clerk would conclude that the cars were filled to max capacity. The clerk, in turn, guesstimated that the cars were filled to about half of their capacity, judging from his experience with loaded coal. Sadly, in reality, the train he would hand over to Engineer Holland would be astronomically heavier than the figures on paper. Had Holland known from the start, he would never have gone with the locomotives he chose, a couple of which had faulty brakes. If the clerk's guess had been right, even with the faulty brakes, the braking power would still have been more than sufficient. But his guess was way off, and so, although Holland didn't know it at the time, his trip on that morning of May 12th was already doomed before it started. As for the fire, the cause goes back to the cleanup effort after the train derailment of May 12th. When the heavy machinery was brought in, one of the backhoes used to clear the trona made several gashes on the pipeline. This caused the line to weaken until it couldn't withstand the pressure of the gas flowing through it anymore. When Calnev first came to inspect the pipeline for leaks and dents, the officials failed to inspect the entire length of the line, examining only specific points instead. Calnev also refused to do a second inspection after the cleanup, which could have brought to their notice the fact that the pipeline was now damaged and much shallower than it had originally been. This string of oversight by Calnev destroyed any chance Duffy Street had of avoiding a second catastrophe. Today, the site of the Duffy Street incident shows little signs of the disaster it endured, although the large, suspicious scar of land that's left could be a tip to later generations that something is off. Meanwhile, residents of Duffy Street who witnessed and were affected by the disaster have all moved out of the neighborhood, now too traumatized to live in San Bernardino. The fact that the Calnev pipeline still runs at the same spot definitely didn't help matters. As for Southern Pacific, it would later update its rules instructing all officials to always assume the cars were filled to their max capacity when the weight of the cargo wasn't specified. But it wouldn't matter, because 7 years later, the company would be bought up by Union Pacific. If you found this video interesting, then don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to bring this video to more people. Also, make sure to check out the channel for more interesting disaster stories.